There would be no greater contrast than me speaking immediately after the member for Melbourne. While his electorate had the highest yes vote in the country, mine had the second highest no vote in the country. And a few things have astonished me since then. First of all, the number of people who were surprised that that was the case. I have always had the understanding that in my electorate the opinion polls were roughly the reverse of what they are nationally. And secondly, the number of people who have said as a democratic principle, I was obliged to break an election commitment as a result of the postal ballot. It's the first time I've ever heard the breaking of an election commitment be described as a democratic principle, but that's how a number of people have sought to put it. Last time this issue was raised in the Parliament, I did vote no. Last time this issue was raised in the Parliament, I did not speak. In fact, of the many hours of debate we've had on marriage equality, this is the first time I've come to the dispatch box. When we first dealt with the marriage equality bill, there had been a resolution that the member for Melbourne just referred to in his speech, where we were told, and it was resolved, that we should consult with our electorates, and having consulted, we should vote accordingly. That meant a very different thing in my part of Sydney to what it meant in many parts of Australia. But after that vote had taken place, we had a discussion within the Cabinet room about marriage equality, and different people were putting their views as to why they'd voted particular ways. And I've checked with Penny Wong, Senator Wong, that she's okay with me saying this, because I would never give up something that was said in the Cabinet room. But she's only yesterday let me know that she was okay with it being repeated. At the end of that discussion in the Cabinet room, where different people had put different views, the discussion was over. We were about to move to the next item on the agenda. And in a very soft, gentle, but clearly audible voice, Penny just uttered the words, "Say black instead of gay and hear how it sounds." I can't think of a single sentence that has had a deeper effect on me than the words that Penny Wong said in the Cabinet room. Say black instead of gay and hear how it sounds. See, not only because of the emotion of hearing those words, but also when you think about my electorate. My part of Sydney does know discrimination. My part of Sydney doesn't know terribly well the discrimination that this legislation seeks to fix. But they know discrimination. When discrimination on the basis of race is happening, including from some prominent people at the other end of this building, my electorate gets targeted full on. When there's discrimination against people on the basis of their faith, my electorate gets targeted absolutely. And they need someone who will fight discrimination and will win. They don't need someone who will run some sort of argument that some forms of discrimination are okay and others aren't. If I'm going to be true to the needs of my electorate, of my part of Sydney, of my neighbours, of that little 3-kilometre circle that I've lived inside all my life, where most of the rest of the people have travelled around the world to be there, they need someone who will fight discrimination fearlessly. Because on national polls, my part of Sydney, the people who get discriminated against there, they're never in the majority. And so if I'm willing to defend them as minorities, I can't pick and choose. Within my part of Sydney, there are census figures which can't be true. In my suburb of Punchbowl, there's something like 4,000 couple households, and yet only 8 identify as same-sex. Now, you look at the statistics around the rest of the country and you think, well, what could that mean? It means a whole lot of people move out. It means a whole lot of people just don't identify. And it also means a lot of people, no doubt, find themselves in terribly unhappy heterosexual relationships. it would manifest itself in a number of ways. But ultimately it also means there are young people in my part of Sydney who, on top of the religious discrimination, on top of the discrimination on the basis of their race and ethnic origin, they cop this one too. And for heaven's sake, I'm not going to leave them on their own. We can't have a situation where there is a credible argument that says because you represent a multicultural community, there's a form of discrimination you must endorse. And I can't be party to that.
Hear, hear.
The amendments that have been put forward and that have been flagged, I indicated before any amendments were proposed in any way that I would be opposing them. That includes amendments that the member for Melbourne will put, which will come from one direction, and the amendments that the member for Warringah will put, which come from another. And I indicated that I'd oppose them for a very simple principle. If this House approves marriage equality in a different form to the Senate, we run a very real likelihood that we get a dispute between the houses that where we're dealing with conscience votes, we have no way of resolving. And if we go through the entire process that postal ballot was, and we get to the end of this year, after the public have been forced through what they've been forced through, after the affected community have gone through what they've gone through, and we still don't get it done, the Australian people will have every right to be deeply frustrated and sick to death of this place. So there will be some amendments that will have a level of merit, I've no doubt, from one side or the other. But to contemplate this not getting done, I think, is truly unthinkable. It's also the case that some of the amendments that have been put to me by some people locally, who I deeply respect, are amendments that defend principles which I agree with, and principles which I do not believe are in the slightest way put at risk by this legislation. This legislation is not the first time that the Marriage Act has presented different definitions to the Christian faith or the Buddhist faith or the Muslim faith. In fact, for the entire history of this Act, it has never been an exact match to any form of religious marriage. Therefore, I don't for the life of me see how suddenly people will be able to stop observing their religious beliefs. I don't see how suddenly charities will have a problem when they already have a view of marriage that doesn't match the Marriage Act. I can't for the life of me see how these problems will arise. And therefore, I can only form the view that there are some people, whether they're inside the Parliament or without, who've been part of the no lobby, who are simply trying to play a game of messaging. And I don't see why the Parliament should be part of that. So if we end up with a clear question, if I thought there was a threat to people being able to preach their religion in their temples, in their synagogues, in their prayer rooms, in their mosques, and I thought that was going to be at threat, then I would support legislation that dealt with that. And if there is ever legislation that puts that at threat, I'll be speaking pretty loudly against it. This legislation doesn't. It absolutely doesn't. And it's disingenuous for people in this House who deal with legislation as the core business of what we do to pretend for a minute that those issues are at threat. I have always been conscious of the fact that the forms of discrimination and hate speech that I have dedicated most of my political career to opposing are forms of discrimination I will never experience. I'll never know what it's like to travel on the train and be abused by a stranger for what you wear. I'll never know what it's like to be in the playground and to be pushed around by other kids because of the colour of your skin. Nor will I know in my life what it's like to be considered different for people, from other people, and less than other people because of who you love. But how can I defend the person who gets abused on the train? Can I defend the child in the school playground? and not also defend the person who's discriminated against on the basis of who they love. And my electorate, my part of Sydney, needs someone who can. My part of Sydney needs someone who can fight discrimination fearlessly and win. I'll be voting yes. There'll be plenty of people in my electorate who are disappointed by that, but no one will be surprised, and no one will see it as anything other than me being completely consistent with the person who presented to them and they chose to elect.
Hear, hear.